Welcome everyone to this event. We want to start by thanking Peace, People Empowered by Acceptance, Conversation and Education, ISU, as well as ISU's Diversity Resource Center for co-hosting this event, and ISU's Cultural Events Committee for the grant funding that helps support this event. We also want to thank Casey at Disability Services for helping us to arrange for real-time captioning and sign language interpretation. We want to thank our interpreters, Sarah and Caitlin, as well as our captioner, Christina, for their work tonight. For those of you who want to view the closed captioning, there is a CC button on your menu for Zoom. And if you go into the settings, you can change the settings, including the size of the captions. So as a brief overview of the session, Chris Stedman is going to speak, and then we're going to have a discussion and Q&A session. And we anticipate that the discussion and conversation is going to be the majority of the session. So I'm going to turn it over now to Jordan, who is the other moderator today, and she will introduce Chris.
Thanks, Mona. I might have missed it, but did you cover the closed captioning as well?
I think I did. So
okay. I must have missed it.
Okay.
Okay. So I am here because I've been part of the peace group that Mona mentioned. And one of the things I really appreciate about peace and our weekly discussions is that we're able to really speak from our own personal experience, and there's not the pressure of speaking for a whole group. And with that, I think it is so fitting that we were able to have author Chris Stedman join us today, because in his book, Faitheist, How an Atheist Found Common Ground with the Religious, I feel like he does just that, shares his story and maybe opens up new ways of thinking for the rest of us. And with that, I think I'll allow Chris to continue introducing himself and get us started.
Sounds good. Thank you so much. First of all, I just want to express my deep gratitude to all of you for being here. I know we're all spending a great deal of time, or many of us at least are spending a great deal of time in front of our screens these days. And so when you voluntarily choose to spend extra time in front of your screen, I think it's very meaningful and it means a lot to me. So thank you. I also want to express my deep gratitude to everyone who is involved in planning this event. I have to say, it's been a long time since I've had such a positive experience with such clear communication about what was going on during the planning stages of this. And I just am very grateful to the organizers for all of the very careful and thoughtful and attentive work that went into this. So thank you very much. I experienced that as an expression of care for the conversation we're going to have. So it's very meaningful to me. Thank you. So as was mentioned in the introduction, I want to keep my opening remarks relatively brief so that we can have a good amount of time for conversation. And I think really just to begin, I'll just share a little bit of, exactly as Jordan was saying, a little bit of my story as a way into the conversation, and then we can go from there. So I grew up in Minnesota, which is where I live now, in a family that was not religious. And really, I describe my childhood not just as non-religious, but as irreligious. And what I mean by that is that we weren't religious, but we didn't really talk about it either. It just wasn't a part of the sort of conversation growing up. So as I started to, get a little bit older, I came to realize that religion was this thing that existed in the world, but I didn't have a very good understanding of it. My understanding did expand somewhat when I was in third grade. We moved, And we moved to a neighborhood where there was another kid my same age who lived just up the street, and she was being raised in a multi-faith household. So her father was Catholic, her mother was Jewish, and she was kind of encouraged to explore and decide for herself what tradition she resonated with. And she ended up really connecting with her mother's Judaism, and she became very involved in her Jewish community. And she invited me over to their house for holidays, and I learned a lot from that friendship. But it really wasn't until I was 11 that religion had a sort of really personal touch in my life. And that's because when I was 11, I had a conversion experience and I became a Christian. And when I look back on that conversion now, I think there were kind of two primary factors that played a part in my ultimate decision to become a Christian. The first was that when I was 11, when right around the time I was invited to an after-school youth group that met at a Christian church by some acquaintances from school, my family was fracturing. My parents were separating. My mom started working 3 jobs, and my whole life felt disrupted. And, because we weren't religious growing up, my family really was the space where I went to explore ethical questions, to find a sense of belonging and identity. And when I lost that, I was really, I felt lost, and I was looking for a place to feel welcome, to feel grounded. And I felt that immediately in this church. But the bigger reason, the second reason, was that about a year prior to converting, I started reading a number of books that detailed some of the greatest atrocities in the history of human civilization. So I was reading John Hershey's Hiroshima, which talks about the atomic bombs that the United States dropped on Japan. I read Anne Frank's Diary of a Young Girl about the Holocaust. And I read Alex Haley's Roots about American slavery. And, I had learned about the events described in these books in school, but they were just presented as these sort of historical facts, as things that had happened. And when I read these books, it was, I had a very different experience, because I was reading the stories of what it was like for people who experienced those things, and encountering those narratives filled me with a profound desire to understand what it means to be human, because I couldn't reconcile the fact that, we could do such inhumane things to one another with my understanding of what it meant to be human. So I felt like I didn't even have the language to articulate what I was struggling with, the kinds of questions that were coming up for me. Granted, I was also very young, and those are very difficult, big questions. But when I was invited to this church, it was like I found my people. I found other people who saw the same problems in the world that I did, and who wanted to understand why these things happened and what our responsibility was in the face of that kind of injustice and cruelty. And so, the church fulfilled these really important needs that I had, these two needs, the need for belonging and the need for meaning, which I think are needs that we all have. Unfortunately, the church, while it seemed very welcoming initially, was less welcoming than, I quickly came to realize it was less welcoming than it initially seemed. And, a big part of that was because they were, a large part of how they propped up their sense of identity internally was by maintaining strict boundaries around the community. They had a very in versus out mindset. And this was particularly true around issues of sexuality. And they frequently and really vehemently demonized LGBT people. And my conversion coincided with a third thing, which was my emerging awareness of my own queerness. And so this presented this huge dilemma for me, because on the one hand, this community was meeting these really important needs that I had. And on the other hand, I suddenly felt like this piece of who I was deeply in conflict with my membership in this community. Fortunately, a few years into that struggle, my mother found a journal that I was keeping where I was writing about the struggle I was having. And she did something really amazing, something that completely changed my life, and that I was so fortunate to be in a position where I had a parent who did this. And that was that my mother went to the phone book and she called up local churches in the community, and she found a Christian church with an LGBT affirming minister, and she took me to speak with him. And that totally changed my life, in part because it was the first time that someone told me that there was more than one way of thinking about and understanding this issue. So this minister didn't tell me what to think. Instead, he pointed me in the direction of resources so that I could think for myself and figure out what I thought about my faith and my sexual orientation. So eventually I made my way into LGBT affirming Christian communities, and I found that space where I could wrestle with these big questions that I had and also be authentically myself. And so eventually I decided I wanted to go to college to study religion, thinking that I wanted to help people who had struggled in the way that I did, with the kinds of questions that I did. But when I got to this Christian university where I started studying religion, I was challenged by my professors, all of whom were Christian, to ask myself why I believed the things that I did. And it was through that process that I came to realize that I had become a Christian, not because of the theological claims of Christianity, which for me had always felt like this kind of package deal, not a sincere expression of what I really believe, but rather this thing I took on in order to get these sort of other pieces. But rather, it was the function of Christianity that had drawn me in, that it had provided a space where I could find a sense of belonging and welcome, a sense of identity and connection. And it had helped me find meaning and a place to sort of wrestle with these big questions. And so really, since then, that has been the sort of driving interest of my life, is supporting spaces where people can find a sense of authentic belonging and identity, and where they can explore these big questions that I think we all have and that we all wrestle with throughout our lives. And so I've worked as a community builder for non-religious people, trying to provide spaces where they can explore those questions of meaning and purpose, and do so in a way that is true to their understanding of the world as non-religious people. And I've also been deeply interested in and involved in efforts to bridge understanding across lines of religious difference, because I firmly believe that it is important for many reasons that we understand people who have different beliefs than we do. But I also believe that we can get to a better understanding of how to answer the kinds of questions that we all wrestle with if we're in conversation with people who don't share our beliefs. So it's not just a matter of wanting to break down the stigmas that exist between various groups and across these lines of religious difference, but also because I think it makes us fuller people when we are in relationship with people who don't see the world in exactly the same way that we do. And so that's a big part of why I am so excited about this conversation that we're going to be having. There are a lot of things that I could sort of cover right now, like some basic definitional work around what atheism even means, or ideas about how we can have productive and meaningful conversations across lines of difference. But I also don't want to be overly prescriptive. And so I think at this point, I'd rather just open up the floor for whatever questions are on your mind, and we'll follow the conversation where it goes. So thank you for giving me a chance to share just a little bit of my own personal background and why, on a personal level, having been sort of in and out of religion over the years, having experienced religion at its best and at its worst, and having this profound need for meaning and belonging in my life as a non-religious person, why this conversation is of such value to me and why I'm so grateful to be in it with you tonight. So, yeah, thank you.
Thank you so much, Chris. So we're going to start the discussion phase. And what we ask is for you to submit your comments or questions either in the chat box, and you can do that to everyone, or if you want to do so privately, you can send it to either me or Jordan. Or if you want to speak, to use the raise hand option, which is in the reactions button, and we'll call on you. And this is just to prevent 40 people from unmuting at the same time. And we also have some questions that were submitted earlier. So go ahead and send us your thoughts, or we can open with one of the previously submitted questions.
So I see a question in the chat about my understanding of scripture as it relates to homosexuality. So I definitely have many thoughts on that. I feel in some ways that the question is not particularly it doesn't have the same, I don't feel the same urgency around that question as others I know do. For example, my boyfriend is in the final stages of his training to be an Episcopal priest, which is a whole other conversation, how we sort of navigate those differences in our relationship. But for him, this question is, a much more, urgent one. For me, my understanding of the Bible as a non-theist is that it is a book that was written by human beings, and that it contains it reflects our humanity, all the sort of best and worst of our humanity. And so, my approach to Christian scripture is to sort of engage with it as I would any other work, as being something that has all kinds of sort of, to be open to what it might have to offer me, and also to be able to sort of set aside what isn't useful for me. And so, there is and this is something when I was 13 and my mother took me to speak with this Christian minister, I learned that, as I mentioned, there's not just this single way of viewing the Christian understanding of sexuality that I had been presented. And I learned there was actually a very robust tradition of encountering Christian scripture and what it has to say about sexuality, and seeing something very different than what I had been taught in this one church. And so, as I said, this is a conversation that many people have been having for a very long time. I think that the way that the Bible not only has been sort of understood and interpreted, but also which parts of it have been emphasized, has a lot to do with who has been in, the position of power to sort of dictate what readings are sort of privileged over others. And so all of that is to say that it's a very complex subject, and one on a personal level that used to feel much more sort of important or loaded than it does to me now. So I think I'll leave it at that. I also, like, in my experience as a chaplain so I worked as a humanist chaplain for the better part of a decade. And the very short version of what that means is that I was charged with supporting the spiritual lives, for lack of a better word, of the non-religious students at the institutions where I served. And so oftentimes, because I was the person who was there to support non-religious people alongside many sort of religious clergy, I would get religious individuals who were struggling with some aspect of their faith and afraid to bring their questions to the clergy in their community. Oftentimes they would come to me instead. And my being openly queer as well meant that I got a lot of people who were struggling with their faith and their sexual orientation. And oftentimes I would reach a point where it was clear that I was not going to be the most helpful person for them. And so I could function as a bridge, knowing that the clergy member in their community who was a friend and colleague of mine was someone that they could trust with their questions, and I could help facilitate that connection. And so with a question like this, for example, that's a question where I would share my perspective on it, but I would say there's real limitations here because I'm not a part of this community that considers this text to be sacred in this way. And so I only have so much to say about it. So yeah, thank you for that.
We had one direct question come into me before the other two in the chat, so I'll ask that one. And it's very similar to some other questions that were submitted earlier. This person wrote, some religious beliefs are fear or shame-based. Can you speak about ways to address any harmful beliefs without invalidating someone's beliefs or causing defensiveness?
Yeah. And I'll just add to that one question that just came in the chat, which is, asking what thoughts do you have on the best ways to initiate cross-religious conversation? In other words, how do you bridge the us versus them divide? And, this is, I think, at the heart of interfaith dialogue. It's interfaith dialogue is easy when you're when you stick to the stuff that, are sort of really simple points of agreement. Like, I often, when I've been involved in interfaith work, one thing that we often do is we'll come together for some kind of community service program to say, this is an issue that we all care about. So we're going to come together and work together around it. And in the process, we'll get to know one another better. And I can learn more about why this issue matters to you and sort of your perspective on that as a person of faith, and I can tell you more about my perspective. That is, a very different kind of conversation than having a really, difficult conversation about a point of immense disagreement, especially like around, when I'm encountering somebody who holds a belief that feels like it is a sort of personal affront to me, or it's sort of personally dehumanizing. And I guess there are a few things I would say about that. One is that it makes me think of this story that's been kind of a guiding story throughout my life or throughout my adult life. And that is that early on in my career doing this work, I was speaking at a school in Southern Illinois. It was one of my first speaking engagements ever, so I was very nervous. And afterwards, after everyone else had sort of cleared out, one person who had attended the talk was still there. And she came up to me after everyone else had left. And she told me, without prefacing it really at all, that I had a demon inside of me that was making me gay. And that she knew that because she had had a demon inside of her that had made her gluten intolerant. And she had had that demon cast out. And so she knew it was possible for me. And I'm not sure if it was the comparison of my sexual orientation to gluten intolerance or what, but I was just, I was kind of shell-shocked. I didn't really know what to say. And I felt multiple reactions arising simultaneously. I felt angry about what she had said. I felt deeply hurt by what she had said. I'm not sure if she knew, but at one point in my life, I had sort of internalized some of those same beliefs, that there was something deeply wrong with me that was making me queer, and so it sort of brought up all those old wounds. I felt like I wanted to sort of lecture her about why this belief was harmful and wrong and bad, and so I wasn't sure which of these responses to offer. And so because I was kind of taken aback, because I wasn't sure how to respond, I took a moment just to take a breath and sort of collect myself. And in that moment, when I did that, I noticed something, which is that she appeared to be kind of afraid of me. She was like looking at the ground between us, not looking right at me. I was able to recall that her voice had been shaking a little bit when she had spoke to me. And despite, all of the righteous indignation and hurt that I was feeling, I felt empathy for her. I felt bad that she was afraid. And that empathy was a kind of gateway. And it allowed me to respond in a way that, and just to be clear, this is like not my everyday response. If you've ever seen me on Twitter, you know, like this is not how I always am. This is like me at my best. But I responded in a way that was a surprise to me, which was, I said to her, you know, I just want to say thank you, because I know that it can be really scary to tell someone something that you think they're not going to respond very positively to. And I think it's brave that you are telling me this. And I'm going to assume that you're telling me this out of genuine concern for my well-being. I mean, if you think there's a demon inside of me, yeah, that's bad. And so I appreciate you putting yourself out there to tell me this thing. And I assume you're doing it because you genuinely care about my well-being, and I appreciate that. So thanks. And I think the only person who was more surprised by what I said than me was her. I think she was expecting this confrontation. She was expecting to see the demon come to life in a way. And instead, it opened this door for an actual exchange between us. I was able to ask her some questions, through which I learned that she had never had a direct interaction with an LGBT person before. She had only heard LGBT people talked about. And I was able to share a little bit more of my own experiences with her, to give her another point of reference, a more sort of direct one. And, you know, I love stories because they can be instructive. And in a story, I love that sort of transformative moment when somebody changes, right? And so I would love to be able to tell you that she had a transformation. And as I was leaving town the next day, I saw her with a big LGBT rights sign by the side of the highway. But that is not what happened. As far as I know, she left that conversation still believing that it was wrong to be LGBT, you know, still perhaps believing that a demon that causes gluten intolerance also causes homosexuality. I'm not sure, because my goal really wasn't to change her mind. I simply wanted to give us a chance to see the humanity in each other just a little bit more. And I think oftentimes we want to go right to the hardest point of disagreement. I know I do. I grew up with 3 siblings close in age, and we fought a lot. And so I love to go right to the point of greatest tension. But I think sometimes we need to sort of take stock of the situation and ask ourselves, what's possible here? And I think in that moment, I was not going to change her mind no matter what I said. But I did have a window to be able to give her another point of reference that maybe planted a seed, so that the next LGBT person she encountered, she had a different interaction with them than she did with me. I don't really know. But I think that oftentimes when coming to these most difficult points of disagreement, we have to take stock of the situation and ask ourselves, what's possible here? And also, am I the right person for this? A big part of what I really value about interfaith work is that, you know, there are some people who are just never going to hear it from me because I'm queer, because I'm an atheist. They're just not open to what I have to say. But they might hear it from someone who they see as in group. And so if I am able to help someone who is a Christian better understand where I'm coming from, they can go back into their community and be an advocate for me in a way that maybe I can't. And also, sometimes I just am not the right person because I'm not having a good day. I don't feel like putting myself through the work of having to really, you know, be very patient with somebody who is saying things that are really hurtful and harmful. And so I think there's just an assessment that we have to do about whether or not we're the right person, whether or not we have the capacity, and also what's possible in any given moment. But I do think that in these relationships, sometimes that start with some of the easier conversations, we have an opportunity to build trust and friendship that can help us go deeper. It's like a friend of mine who is a community organizer who, you know, works on immigration justice issues. And when he's working with primarily Latino and Latinx folks, he is often working side by side with Catholic priests who serve communities that are majority Latinx. But he also has a huge passion for reproductive justice. And oftentimes when he's doing that activism, he's like on the opposite side with the priests that he's worked with on immigration justice. But he's told me that the work that they do together on this issue that they both have a shared passion for helps make it easier for them to have these harder conversations, because those folks can no longer sort of completely dismiss him as someone who they have nothing in common with and share no values with, because they've worked side by side on this other thing. And I think that oftentimes we start in a certain place. Maybe we start by just getting to know one another as friends or working on a shared value that we have. And that enables us to build, again, the relationships and trust that allow us to go deeper. So that's one thing I would offer for what is definitely a big question that I think varies. The response varies much, depending on the situation. So thank you for that. So we have a question here that from someone who is a Unitarian Universalist atheist, and just wanted to for me to expand on what I mean by faith, which is a great question. It's a hard question. First of all, I just want to say it's great to connect with you, Jennifer, sorry, I'm trying to move between the different screens here. So I technically am a member of a Unitarian Universalist congregation here in Minneapolis. It's called First Unitarian Society of Minneapolis. It is a historically humanist UU congregation, by which I mean, if you go to one of their events, it's unlikely that you'll hear any sort of talk of God. They are sort of overtly a non-theistic community. I didn't this last winter, obviously, because we're in a pandemic, but every December, my brother and I go to their winter solstice celebration, which I absolutely love. And I also went to a Unitarian Universalist theological school. So I have a lot of affection for Unitarian Universalists and may technically be one since I'm a member of that congregation. But all of that is to say, the word faith is one of those words that's extremely slippery, and people often mean very different things when they use it. And I think that faith, as it is sort of most widely used, like in sort of, common parlance, is often, there's this sort of implicit idea that faith involves something supernatural. I mean, this is the same with spirituality. So I remember when I was serving as a humanist chaplain, we did an event once on spirituality, and we asked our students beforehand at the very beginning of the program to raise their hands if they considered themselves spiritual, or if that language connected with them. And about half of them raised their hand. And then we asked, raise your hand if you don't consider yourself spiritual, and about the other half did. And I think it's because with both of those words, they have come to be associated with, supernatural or theistic beliefs. And so oftentimes I don't use them to describe myself and my worldview, because I think people often hear something other than what I mean when I'm using that language. But I think that obviously faith and spirituality both have a much more complex and rich history than simply being associated with, certainly, I think living in the United States, those things are often especially associated with Christianity and with particular forms of Christianity, forms that have been, sort of privileged because they are practiced by the dominant groups. And so all of that, I say all of that because part of what I really love about being in interfaith conversations is that, we live in the United States in what is, I believe, the most religiously diverse society in the history of the world. And yet we also have critically low levels of religious literacy. So we know very little about religion. We know even less about those who practice things that are different, beliefs that are different from our own. And so, words like faith, like spirituality, become very loaded, and they're not well understood. And what I love about interfaith conversations is they give us a chance to actually sort of dig into what those mean, and to see, actually, even in a group where you might assume this is a sort of religiously homogenous group, like a group of Christians, if you were to ask 10 Christians what they mean by faith, what they mean by God, what role they think God plays in their life and in the world, you would get 10 very different answers. For example, I teach now in a department of religion and philosophy at a Lutheran university. And though I'm not Lutheran, I am surrounded by them. and so I'm very influenced by Lutheran thinking. And one Lutheran theologian whose work I really appreciate and admire is a man named Dietrich Bonhoeffer. Some of you may be familiar with him already, but if you're not, he was a Lutheran theologian living in Germany at the time of the rise of the Nazis. And he felt that Christians had a responsibility to live as if there is no God. And what he meant by that is that rather than expecting a higher power to intervene in human affairs, particularly in the face of injustice, it was his position that Christians have a responsibility to work to discern the will of God and then act as God's agents in the world. And for him, that meant attempting to assassinate Hitler, which ultimately is why he was imprisoned. And when I think about a theology like the one espoused by Dietrich Bonhoeffer, this idea that to be a Christian means to live as if there is no God, I see great overlap with my own worldview as an atheist and a humanist who believes that it's ultimately up to human beings to address the problems that we all face. And yet, I think 15 years ago, if I were to encounter a Lutheran, I would have all kinds of assumptions around what their Lutheranism meant, that they did expect a higher power to intervene in the world in some way. And so, and I would have had no idea that there was actually this rich history within the Lutheran tradition of this theological position that's very aligned with my own view of the world. And so that's a thing that I've only been able to learn by being in relationship with and influenced by people who hold those beliefs. So it's one great benefit, I think, of those kinds of conversations. So some wonderful questions coming up in the chat. How do you become a humanist chaplain? It's a great question. So when I was doing my master's in religion, I knew that I wanted to help support spaces for people who fall outside of traditional religious categories, but who still have these needs for meaning and for belonging. But I had no idea what that would look like in terms of actual sort of professional work. But I learned that there was a humanist community at Harvard University that had actually existed for decades. It was a chaplaincy program that was founded by a man named Tom Farrick. Tom was a Catholic priest who stopped believing in God, but still wanted to help people as they navigated the big questions in life. And so he established this humanist chaplaincy. And I believe it was the first non-Judeo-Christian chaplaincy at Harvard. Today, Harvard has over 40 chaplains representing a variety of different worldviews, including a Baha'i chaplain, a Zoroastrian chaplain. And Tom Farrick was actually really critical to the expansion of the chaplaincy. Once he founded the humanist chaplaincy, he really advocated for chaplains to help support students of minority faith communities. And so this chaplaincy existed for decades, and I ended up going to work for them. And then after 4 years there, a group at Yale University was it was a group of faculty, students, alums, and they really wanted to see a similar program exist there. And so eventually I came down to help them build that program, and I was there for 4 years as well. But there are very few opportunities right now to do humanist chaplaincy professionally. I never expected to end up in institutions like Harvard and Yale. I am now back in Minnesota, which was ultimately like my long-term goal, was to end up back here so I could be close to family. And it happened a little sooner than I was anticipating for a few reasons. My stepdad has Alzheimer's, and so part of why I came back was to help with caring for him. But there are more and more humanist chaplains now. There are a few in higher ed, but more and more in hospital settings, especially. And so most humanist chaplains at this point, because there's not a formal training program, will go get a Master of Divinity often, especially at a Unitarian Universalist theological school, as I did. And yet, like, so a few decades ago, the Muslim community was going through a sort of similar moment where there was not a sort of path to doing Muslim chaplaincy. And so a program got started at a seminary in Connecticut called Hartford Seminary, where they developed a chaplaincy program for those who wanted to do Muslim chaplaincy. And there are sort of some nascent efforts underway to develop similar kinds of chaplaincy programs for humanists. But as of now, most folks who are doing humanist chaplaincy either sort of piece together a program or they end up going down a Unitarian Universalist path. And anyone who's involved in a Unitarian Universalist community knows that Unitarian Universalist communities have long been spaces where atheist and humanist folks have found community. There's a long running joke, which is, what do you call an atheist with children? A Unitarian Universalist. So, yeah. Let's see. One question I got that was sent to me privately was, will humanity ever accept atheists as another faith belief rather than treat it as other outside the formal religions? So this is a great question, because one thing that I think a lot of folks who aren't atheists may not always be aware of is that there's, perhaps you are, perhaps not, but there's a great deal of stigma around atheism, particularly here in the United States, in other parts of the world as well. But there, for example, the Public Religion Research Institute does a religious warmth survey regularly, where they ask respondents to rate how warmly or sort of cold they feel towards various religious categories. And atheists and Muslims are statistically tied regularly for the most negatively viewed religious or ethical category. So people have very low opinions of atheists. There are a lot of negative associations around being an atheist, and there are multiple reasons for this. I think, one is very obvious, which is the way that dominant religious groups have talked about atheism in very sort of otherizing and stigmatizing ways, and who have sort of really emphasized that there's a strong link between being a moral person and being religious. But it's also more complex than that. At the root of anti-atheist bias is distrust. There was a study done by the University of British Columbia that found that even atheists have a more negative view of other atheists, and that it is related to the fact that we have this sort of deep-seated idea that if you think that somebody is not watching your actions, you're less likely to act in ways that are moral or good. And because that's such a deeply embedded idea, that sort of is at the foundation of why a lot of people have negative views of atheists. And so, this is one benefit of interfaith conversation, is it gives us an opportunity, especially those of us who are in a group that's not always very well understood or may experience stigma, to humanize our community. Of course, it's very easy for someone in that position to end up being tokenized rather than being able to be a sort of full, complex human. And so I always really encourage people who are entering into interfaith conversation to follow their curiosity, to be open and empathetic, but also to let the person who is speaking just be an individual rather than a representative for an entire group of people who they can't possibly speak for. And so Yeah, but I think the other thing that I want to say about your question is that atheism, whether or not atheism will ever be accepted as another faith belief, rather than being treated as other, i.e., outside of the formal religions. The thing about atheism is that you knowing I'm an atheist, all that tells you is my position on a single question. This question whether or not a God or multiple gods exist. And so all you know is that, and I consider myself an agnostic atheist in the sense that I think it's an unanswerable question given the available information we have right now. It's beyond our ability, I think, to definitively sort of measure or prove whether or not there is or isn't a God. I'm an atheist in the sense that I think it is the most likely position given the information I have. And so that's how I live. I live as if there isn't a God, but I'm open to being challenged or learning something that might shift my understanding. And so that's another sort of stereotype about atheists, I think, which is this idea that atheists are certain, that they know there's not a God, and which I think, we know is not true of faith groups, right? To be a Christian doesn't necessarily mean you're certain that there is a God. But atheism itself is not a belief system. It's simply a sort of position on a single question. And so part of why I don't just identify as an atheist, though I am an atheist, and that's a central part of my worldview, and it's foundational and important, and I, own it without shame or stigma. I also identify as a humanist because humanism is a worldview. It's a philosophy of life that doesn't just tell you what I don't believe, but also tells you beliefs that I do have. And if you're not familiar with humanism, I strongly encourage you to go check out the Humanist Manifesto. It's a really short document that was created by consensus by a group of secular humanists. There are 3 editions. The most recent one, the 3rd edition, is the one I would recommend. And that's also the communities that I've been a part of are humanist communities, because if I'm a part of a group of fellow atheists, all I know is that these are people who share my atheism. I don't know if they share any of my other values. And there are many atheists who don't share a lot of my values. A few years ago, I wrote a piece for Vice on the growing number of atheists who are involved in white supremacist movements. Richard Spencer, who's the self-appointed leader of the alt-right white supremacist movement, has been very vocal about his atheism. And I can't say that Richard Spencer is not an atheist, but I can point to the values of secular humanism and say those are in contrast with, his beliefs and what he does in the world. So all of that is to say that I think that we have a long way to go before atheism is more widely accepted, even though the religiously unaffiliated are the fastest growing segment of the religious landscape in the United States. The majority of those folks do not identify as atheist. The number of atheists has grown, but at a much lower rate than the rest of the non-religious. The majority of folks who are not religious still say that they believe in a God or a higher power. Most of them simply consider themselves unaffiliated. They're not a part of a religious community, but they aren't necessarily an atheist either. And so because atheists still represent such a small slice of the population, we have a hard time pushing back against stigma that we face. And while every group experiences, I think one real challenge that atheists experience is that, we're portrayed in the media as being very anti-religious, very headstrong, very certain. Who speaks for atheism in the media? It tends to be the most sort of anti-religious perspective, even though there was a study done out of the University of Tennessee at Chattanooga that found that a very small minority of atheists consider themselves anti-religious, and the majority of atheists do not. That's the perspective that we tend to see in media. But while every community struggles with this, right? Like the Westboro Baptist Church is a very tiny little group that has had an outsized influence in the public imagination because the media is drawn to stories of conflict. The difference is when you see the Westboro Baptist Church on the news, most people seeing that know other Christians, and so they have other data points, and when it comes to shaping their understanding of Christianity. So they may see the Westboro Baptist Church, but they can also say to themselves, well, sure, they're Christians, but also I know all these other Christians who practice Christianity very differently. But they may see an atheist on the news and not know that they know another atheist. And so again, I think one real value of these conversations is it gives folks, especially in groups that are smaller and more stigmatized, an opportunity to push back. But I think we have a long way to go. And I think, the distinction between atheism and humanism is important. So thank you for that question. I really appreciate it.
So it looks like we have a number of questions in the chat, but there were a couple of private ones that came in first. So I'm going to ask you those first, and then we can go to the public ones. What are some suggestions to help activate the Pocatello community members towards love, belonging, and understanding of people of color through their faiths?
Yeah. So I think that one of the things that I have found really transformative when being involved in interfaith work is that, interfaith dialogue at its best is intersectional. It gives us an opportunity to talk about all of the different identities that we bring to the table and how those relate to our understanding of the world. And so I'm not only talking about my atheism, I'm also talking about my queerness, and I'm talking about, how my own whiteness influences the way that I've understood the world. And I think back to when I was an adolescent reading books like Roots and Hiroshima and The Diary of a Young Girl, and how these stories were so unsettling, so shell-shocking to me, in part because of the privileges that I experienced as a white person in the United States. These were not things I had personally experienced, and I didn't live with their legacy in the same way that other people did. And so when we enter into interfaith conversation, part of what we are given as a gift is this opportunity to hear from the perspectives and stories and experiences of people who move through the world in ways that we never will. And while I can have, empathy for people who have different experiences than I do, I'll never be able to walk through walk in their shoes and see the world in their through their eyes. And so, I think that we have profound limitations to how much we can understand based on our own experience, which is why it's critically important that we enter into spaces where we are given, again, the profound gift of being able to hear from someone else who has experienced the world in a different way than we do. And this is not just limited to different, faith or religious identities. It also has, again, interfaith dialogue at its best is about bringing all of these different identities into conversation. And so I would say, when it comes to activating your local community around, these kinds of conversations, I think that some of the most, like, one example from my own life is years ago, I was having a conversation with a woman who is Muslim and who's a woman of color and who wears a hijab. So she is often read as Muslim as a result. And we were just talking about basketball. I think I believe I tell this story in Faitheist for those. I know some of you were reading it. And she started sharing with me about how she had experienced horrible street harassment because of her identity and how she was read by others. And as she was telling me this story, there were many aspects of her story that I could not relate to on a personal level because she had experienced things that I never will. But I could understand on some level the fear that she felt walking down the street sometimes, because it was I also felt fear walking down the street because I had been verbally and physically harassed because I was read as queer. And even though, again, our experiences were profoundly different, it gave me an opportunity to understand, based on my own experience, how, just get the smallest sense of how that might have felt for her. We wouldn't have had the same exact experience, and I think, it's important to not equate those experiences, but to say, I have felt fear. I understand the feeling of being unsafe in public, and I think back on that now, and it's wild to me that I had no idea that that was a thing that she would experience. I had no idea that Muslim women get harassed in public. Now, of course, I know that this happens all the time. But it was profoundly eye-opening to hear from her and her experience, and to be able to, on some level, connect it to an experience I had had. Again, not equating those experiences, but to say, okay, this gives me a window into an experience I've never had and never will have. And it makes me think of something I have experienced that helps me sort of understand how that might have felt in some way. And so I think that, it's easier when we can make those personal connections, right? It was easier for me to understand what she was describing because I also had experienced violence from strangers walking down the street. Where it becomes more difficult and all the more important to listen and be in conversation is when you can't relate to it. And there are many things about her experience as a woman of color that I will never be able to relate to. I could relate to that one specific example, but there are many others that I can't. And so, I think that is, one of the, again, it's sort of like what I was saying earlier about sometimes you start with the easier place in the conversation. And then as you develop trust and build relationships, you can enter into the things that are harder to understand. I think that that's particularly true as you get into experiences that are further and further removed from something that you have ever experienced. It is a profound gift to have a relationship of trust where you can learn through that relationship. So I think that oftentimes with interfaith initiatives, someone will go to one event and think, okay, now I've met people from other groups and communities. And there is value in that. There's real value in that. But I think that where transformation happens at the deepest level is in relationships. And so I think it's important, to sort of keep showing up and keep developing those relationships. So that's just one piece of advice I would offer.
Thank you. This next one, the person says, thank you so much for doing this event. I grew up in southeastern Idaho as a fourth generation Mormon / Latter-day Saint. And at age 12, I learned for the first time we were an quote unquote anti-gay church. This realization caused me to leave because it conflicted with my own moral compass, even at age 12. I still have many friends and family who are still in the Mormon / LDS church, and it causes a lot of dissonance for me knowing they still hold these anti-LGBT views. How have you managed to resolve that dissonance for yourself? Have you managed to resolve that dissonance for yourself?
A great question. I often think that these kinds of interfaith differences are that much harder to navigate in family contexts than, like, it's easier for me to have a conversation with someone who is a part of a faith group that's not LGBT affirming than it is to talk to my uncle who is Christian and not LGBT affirming. Because it's in a family context, it just becomes so much more complicated. And so, I think I think about like friendships I have where I have one friendship, for example, from many, many years ago, back when I was a Christian, this person is still a Christian. And I remember early on in my atheism, after I'd realized I wasn't a Christian anymore, when I was I was at that point, I was feeling like very provocative all the time. I always wanted to like poke at people who had different beliefs than I did, especially Christians. And I remember we were on a walk once and I asked her, so do you think I'm going to hell? And she, paused to think about it. And she very thoughtfully, 'cause she's a very thoughtful person, said, that's not something I decide, right? Like, I believe that that's between you and God, and like I can't possibly imagine to understand like the mind of God. And so I don't know, but and I sort of pushed her, like, and I was like, okay, but like if you had to guess, like, what do you think? She eventually was like, well, I guess like, yeah, I guess maybe. Yeah, maybe. And then I was like, oh, how could you? After I had sort of poked at her until she said it. And yet, like, because we had been friends for so long, like it was the friendship was still there. Maybe it got, a little tense. I kind of kept my distance a little bit more after that. But eventually, we sort of, we talked more, we kept sort of growing closer. We kept revisiting the conversation. And, I was able to get to like different dimensions of it. Like I was able to see that actually like what had been a fun intellectual exercise for me to be like, poke, 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 do you think I'm going to hell? Was actually like a very painful, complicated question for her because she deeply loved me and she wasn't sure what she thought about this. And the idea of me, being in hell was very sad for her. And actually she was very sad when I stopped being a Christian for that reason. She felt conflicted about it. She was happy because I seemed like I was being more true to myself, but she was sad because of this belief she had. And the longer our friendship has gone on, the more we've been able to have like honest conversations about that. And I think that there are like, that's very different from my uncle, for example, who like, there's not really openness there. And so I've kind of gotten to a place in that relationship where I've said, I'm not going to spin my wheels on that anymore. Versus, this friend of mine who I feel like treats me with dignity and, is and loves me enough to want to be honest with me and trusts me to be able to ride through that difficult conversation with her. And so I think, again, like how I've managed to navigate those relationships, so much of it depends on, like, I think that there are some basic ground rules that have to be met. And one of them is this person needs to be able to treat me with dignity, and there needs to be trust that they will, that I can tell them what I think honestly, and they can tell me what they think honestly. And so much of that just has to do with, having that basic dignity in place. And so that to me, I think that plays a big role in whether or not those conversations are fruitful. But before I finish, I just want to also say thank you for sharing that. And that I know how difficult those relationships can be to navigate, and that I think it's obviously, you sound like a very principled person, and I think it's very courageous what you did when you were younger. And I think you having those principles and that courage, will be assets as you try to navigate those conversations. So I would just encourage you to trust those as you do. So thanks.
It looks like Mona is raising her hand, so I thought maybe we could let her go next.
Thank you, Chris. Everything you're sharing has created so much beautiful reflection for me. And thank you for sharing your story and experiences. As someone, I'm a Baha'i, I belong to the Baha'i faith, and every place that I have lived, I have always been a minority in my religion. I have lived in 4 different countries, always a minority. And one thing that has been very fascinating to me is because I am a person of color, I'm already the weird person, right, in the community. So people have a really easy time to accept that this weird person from this weird country with this weird language also happens to have a weird religion. So I find a lot of love and acceptance from everyone. People ask me, so if I tell them about the rules and regulations or the laws of my faith, whether it has to do with prayer or fasting or dietary restrictions, people are very open to it. And they're like, oh, okay, they're very open-minded about it. But what has been really fascinating to me is the experience of other Baha'is in Pocatello and in other places that I have lived that happen to be white American, and they have switched religions and have become Baha'is. And oftentimes when we are in a same setting, they always share to me how hard their experience it is for them to watch how nice people are to me and how tolerant people are to me, because they're like, okay, she's just different culture, different religion. It's okay for her to be that. But it's really hard for people to accept that someone that looks like them and comes from the same background might have chosen a very different spiritual path. And they deal with tests and difficulties that I'm not subjected to. So can you kind of like maybe address that of how do we create communities where people from who kind of step away from the norm, how do we create communities that they feel welcomed in the process?
Yeah, thank you so much. It's such an apt observation, and I've experienced it myself as well. Being someone who is sort of very public about my atheism and about my sexual orientation, I end up hearing from, and being very involved in interfaith work, I end up hearing from a lot of people from, different parts of the world and different communities. And I've heard from, for example, a number of LGBT Muslims who, I have I've had very meaningful relationships with and events with Muslim communities, but I'll hear sometimes from LGBT Muslims who say, you are being accepted by these individuals because you already seem very different in all these other kinds of ways. So it's okay that you're LGBT. Whereas, me being LGBT feels like I'm rejecting something, or I'm threatening something in the identity. And likewise, like sometimes I will struggle when I'm having conversations with Christians because my story feels like it's a rejection of their identity rather than an expression of, who I am and what I believe. And so there is something about having, those sort of double, you're that much more removed, and so they're that much more sort of easy to accept. And so first of all, I just want to thank you for bringing that dynamic into the conversation, because I think it's very true and very relevant, and something I've experienced as well. But one thing I have found, and so I'll just focus on the sort of Christian conversation, because that's an identity that I've sort of moved into and out of. One thing I have found is sometimes when I initially encounter somebody who is a Christian and they hear just a little bit of my story, that I was a Christian and I'm now an atheist, they sort of see me one way. But if we get a chance to actually engage with one another, and I get to sort of share my story, as I did with all of you, about how, I sort of entered into Christianity because I was looking for this community and this sense of meaning and belonging, but not because it was actually an authentic expression of who I felt I was and how I saw the world. And that, it was actually Christians who helped me sort of find the language to describe who I am. Then they have an opportunity to see a very different, to see it in a very different way. And oftentimes I've had very fruitful conversations with Christians who initially felt, they later admitted that they felt threatened or defensive when they first sort of encountered me, and they were then able to better understand. And so, I think like this is a thing I hear from many atheists, again, having worked as a chaplain with many students over the years who maybe come from a faith background and are realizing that they don't believe that, but want to understand how to communicate that to their families without it feeling like they are rejecting the way that their parents raised them or rejecting their family's identity. And again, I think that, the fact when we don't have these conversations in an intersectional way that acknowledges the sort of ways that our spiritual or secular or religious identities intersect with these other pieces of our identity, we don't realize, that what it means for you to be Baha'i is very different than what it might mean for somebody else to be Baha'i, and the way that they move through the world as a Baha'i person and what they experience is going to be very different from what you do. Just as, my experiences as a queer atheist are going to be different from the experiences of, a very prominent cisgender heterosexual white male atheist like Richard Dawkins. He has a very different experience of the world than I do. I don't think I have a solution to the challenge that you have rightly identified. Rather, I share the experience, and I think that when we enter into these trusting relationships, we have an opportunity to take these conversations that often feel really abstract or like they are about rejecting an identity and ground them in our personal experience, and that often changes the way that they're received. Not always, but sometimes. So thank you very much.
It looks like there might be a couple more questions in the chat box, and apologies if I've missed yours. So this one says, I loved hearing about the books you've read as a kid/adolescent to expose yourself to human suffering and resilience. Are there any other recommendations you would add for kids in 2021?
Yeah, that's a great question. I continue to think that books or other forms of media can be profoundly impactful, especially when you're growing up in a community where, because I think relationships are immensely transformative, and this bears out in the data. The Pew Research Institute did this study on the American opinions on same-sex marriage. So they looked at, shifting public opinions on same-sex marriage because same-sex marriage is the sort of issue where we've seen the fastest change in public opinion in the shortest amount of time in the history of this country. So an overwhelming majority of Americans went from, or a majority of Americans went from opposing same-sex marriage to supporting it in a really short period of time, within a decade. And so Pew did this study to understand why. And the number one reason that was given by people who said they changed their minds and went from opposing same-sex marriage to supporting it was having a relationship with someone who was gay or lesbian. And so I think that relationships ultimately are where we are able to sort of most transform our understanding of the world and expand our horizons beyond the sort of narrow limitations of our own experiences. But we can't always we can't have a relationship with every single person in the world. And many of us live in communities where we're limited. And so I think that stories, whether they are embodied in a person and in a relationship or expressed in a text of some kind, have the ability to help us expand our horizons. And, I am the book person in my family. So for all the holidays and birthdays, I always give books. I selfishly partially just do it because it makes it that much easier for me to figure out what I'm going to get someone. If I know I'm just getting a book, then I just go, I'm like, okay, let me find a book for this person. And I have 2 nephews and a niece, and increasingly I'm trying to be mindful of what kinds of stories they are being exposed to. And so, like I said, I can get into a number of specifics. One that I would definitely recommend is a friend of mine. Well, actually, I was going to say, maybe what I'll do is I can send an email to the organizers after, and then with a few recommendations, and they could share them with anyone who is interested, rather than, because I recognize we're coming up against the end of our time here, and I just want to be mindful of attending to other questions. But thank you. That's a great question.
Yeah, and that's a nice reminder for me to let everyone know that you'll be getting an email from us through the Peace email address where you got the original link for tonight. And that will be coming out in the next few days with a link to the recording in case you want to view any of this again, or some people weren't able to join today. And so absolutely, Chris, anything you want us to share in that email, we certainly can. The other question we had was, atheism tends to be more widely accepted on college campus than established religions. What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, so I think that one thing that, and this kind of gets at the heart of why I think these kinds of conversations are so important, is there's this misguided notion, I think, that, because, so there's this idea, right, that we don't want to privilege any sort of particular religious expression. That's sort of this Central American idea, and I think it's a good one. We don't want our government to be privileging one particular religious expression, but I think that there's this misguided reaction to that, which is this idea that we just push all conversation of religion out of the public square, but that's really not what that means. And so I think, unfortunately, because religion feels like this very loaded topic, because people have this idea that we shouldn't talk about religion with strangers, especially, that really sort of perpetuates this this idea that we should sort of mostly just talk to people that we already know about religion, who are going to be more likely to share our views already, rather than stepping outside of our comfort zone. And so I think as a result of this, religion as an identity category hasn't been treated in higher ed in the same way that other identity categories have been, and thus isn't always sort of brought into the conversation in the way that it should be. And I think that in these discussions we have an opportunity to broach those conversations. And so, yeah, I think, I don't know if atheism is more widely accepted on college campuses or not. Some of the data I've seen suggests that, again, there are many people who consider themselves religiously unaffiliated or non-religious. A smaller number of those consider themselves atheists. But I do think there is this idea in college and university settings that in some college and university settings that we shouldn't talk about religion. And that has made, other religious identities, that has sort of marginalized them in college and university settings. And I think that it is really important to recognize that this is one facet of people's identities that informs how they experience the world and how they're treated by others. And we should make sure that it's part of these conversations. So, yeah, thanks for that.
If you don't mind, Chris, I'd like to throw out one more question. So I grew up here in Southeast Idaho and grew up feeling hurt by the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. And as I ended up in college, I found a community of atheists that I really connected with. We spent a lot of time complaining about religion, honestly. But we also tried to connect with the community. And then I got involved in Peace, which is basically focused on interfaith discussions. And I tend to find more value there. But I find that there's still a part of me that really wants to complain about religion. And I have certain people that I go and do that with. But I notice some guilt coming up because I interact with individuals that are part of that religion who I don't view poorly. And I'm just wondering if you have thoughts on that or can relate to it.
Yeah, absolutely can relate to it. One thing, So I think there are a few things. One, it is, I think, very important to have set apart spaces with like-minded people where you can talk about your experiences, that, you know, where that's a safe space where you can, yeah, you can express yourself honestly. But I would also say that oftentimes I have been surprised. These days, I'm not surprised because I've sort of experienced it enough times, but especially earlier in life, I would be surprised when those moments would slip out when I was talking to someone who was religious, and I would find that oftentimes they shared those frustrations, or a lot of them. You know, some of the Christians I know, for example, are even more critical of Christianity than even I am, because they are still in it, you know, and so one thing I have really appreciated learning about, like, here's one example. I think if you were to ask me a decade ago, and I think if you were to ask a lot of people this question, they would say the same thing. But if you were to ask me a decade ago, you know, are Catholics, you know, anti-LGBT, or are Catholics more likely to be anti-LGBT? Even though I knew Catholics who were affirming, I would say, yeah, definitely. But what I was very surprised a few years ago to learn that statistically speaking, Catholics in the United States are actually more supportive of legal protections for same-sex individual, or for LGBT individuals, and legal recognition of same-sex relationships than the general public. So more Catholics are actually LGBT affirming than the general public, which that really surprised me. And, you know, I think our understanding is shaped by, you know, who is speaking for these communities and traditions. And one thing I've learned as I've gotten to know more Catholics over the years and had more conversations with them is that, you know, whatever frustrations I might feel about the Catholic Church as someone who stands outside of the institution, who isn't impacted by the institution to be sure, but who in many ways sort of exists outside of it, are, you know, in some ways they pale in comparison to people I know within the Catholic institution who, you know, feel immensely frustrated and hurt by the institution. And so, you know, I share that to say, like, I absolutely relate. I also think there's real value in having spaces where you can be among like-minded others and not worry about saying, you know, something that might hurt somebody else. I think your feelings of guilt come from, if I can guess, they come from a place of genuinely caring about people who are in these groups that have also hurt you, and recognizing that, you know, they are not necessarily responsible for what this group has done as a whole, or what, you know, who speaks for this group has said. But I also, you know, the only sort of piece I offer is that I have actually found great comfort in, and healing even in, my own sort of frustrations that I feel from actually connecting with other folks in those groups who I learn, you know, share a lot of my same feelings. So not only has it helped me challenge my understanding of what that group is as a whole, it's also helped me find a sense of camaraderie and healing, knowing that there are people within that group who share those concerns and frustrations, and who are actively trying to transform those systems inside of them. So yeah, there's much more we could talk about, but it's a great question. So thank you.
So we're pretty much at time. So I want to be respectful of everyone's rest of your evening plans. So thank you so much, Chris, for joining us, and to our accessibility providers. Yes, go ahead and give a virtual clap if you would like. So we'll be sending out an email with information on how to access the recording, Chris's recommendations for books, and also information about Peace. So that group meets every Wednesday for discussions like these. And hopefully from tonight, you're, getting some new ideas, and it'll encourage you to build bridges and have some of these conversations, even the difficult ones, and build more community relationships. So thank you all for participating and hope you have a great night.
Yeah, thank you all so much for being here. And thank you again to everyone who's involved in planning this event and making it possible. Thank you so much.